Evening all. I usually absolutely love covering Nakamura games. I don't think this game will be an exception. It was his game against Yasser Seirawan in the US Championship, which you probably know the result, but I'll keep that in suspense. Okay, so Nakamura played, this is 19th of May, he played E4 against Yasser Seirawan, who by the way is a brilliant commentator, book writer. He still actively plays on the ICC. I actually had a game with him on the ICC not too long ago, and he crushed me. So Yasser did very well, I think, last year in the US Championship, but not so hot this year. Now, Yasser chooses the French defence, and actually, interesting on move 2, Nakamura plays not, in a novel way. He plays F4, the Bourdonnais variation. Very rarely seen at Grandmaster level. So why is that? I've kind of indicated that after D5, E5, I think I covered an over the board game once, where black here, the knight on G8 can make use of F5. Usually it's chased back to D7 and hasn't got any access to F5. And this is one of the reasons why this isn't considered to be a critical test of black, that this advanced pawn chain suffers from F5, and of course if black plays C5, then white will have to spend time playing C3 to play D4 usually, and this diagonal might also be exposed. Black actually does take the opportunity to play C5. So now after knight F3 we see knight C6, and now after C3 we see a natural looking knight Qe7 to play, potentially knight F5 and secure the knight potentially with H5. This sets the scene for what happens actually. Very interesting move, which I think a Russian GM I've seen plays this, who plays in the UK, Chernev, plays this a lot, this system, I think, with the knight coming here. So it's like now, okay, it's an advanced variation of the French defence, where this knight coming via this route is quite novel and often effective, because the knight's one way of coming to the centre, for example, or even just supporting a bishop E3 as needed later on, maybe. So knight F5 looks as though, what's the trouble with the black position? Okay. Well, is the knight a target? Although it looks good, it's potentially a tactical target. So knight C2, and it's secured down with H5 against G4s. Okay, and now white actually plays bishop D3. He wants to eliminate that knight and maybe double black's pawns. Yasser plays G6, giving him the option of recapturing if it is taken with either the E pawn or the G pawn. Now with the E pawn, maybe black can get a knight to E6. With the G pawn, maybe black can try and use G file pressure later. The problem with taking the G pawn is that the H5 pawn is going to be isolated. Taking with the E pawn, maybe D5 is a bit looser, but factor in the D file here. It looks as though D5 isn't going to be such an exploitable concern. But okay, what happens now? White simply castles, and he's not worried about things like C4, bishop C5 check, king H1. He's not going to fall in for this kind of cheapo where he gets mated because of this knight. Because after C4, I assume he would just take actually on F5. Black actually plays bishop E7, and without any prompting, he takes on F5. And I believe, well, Yasser took with a G pawn, and I think in an interview after the game, he expressed regret actually that he didn't just take with the E pawn here. So if he takes with the E pawn, it does offer that E6 square for either a knight or immediately a bishop. And it doesn't look as though black's structure here is less fragile in some respects than taking with the G pawn. That isolated pawn can be victimized potentially, but for the moment it looks safe enough because it's only the queen eyeing that pawn potentially if the knight moves and the rook's protecting it. But where is the black king going? You know, if it maybe tries to castle queenside, or is it going to lurk around here and leave the rook here? Okay, so after d4, we see actually the move h4. Now maybe this wasn't entirely necessary as a move, because the pawn actually might be a liability more on h4 than it is on h5. Let's just put that back for a moment. So, and consider this. h4. Now, could black, you know, have considered other moves like bishop d7 or queen c7 and just try and maybe castle, you know, queenside? What would be an engine suggestion here? h4 is actually mentioned, or b6, and actually the evaluation, interestingly, is about equal here. b6 was even cd4. Interestingly, and we see in this, you know, h4 comes up there anyway, and here, okay, it's interesting. So it's about equal. It's not as if black doesn't seem to be in dire trouble from an engine perspective after h4. Okay, so d takes c5 was played here, which for the moment lures away the bishop away from h4. Bishop takes c5 check, and now bishop e3. And white is increasing his control of d4, but with pieces now. And black doesn't really want to take that, because knight takes e3 looks as though that pawn might be vulnerable to queen e1s, and this knight might actually also be usefully supporting pressure on d5 with a later c4 maybe. Okay, so in this position, black refused to exchange the bishops. Yasser played bishop e7, which looks fair enough, but we have a mini restrain, blockade, destroy here move, h3. It restrains this h4 pawn, blockades it with a pawn, makes it a target, a fixed target for, say, queen e1 or even bishop f2 and queen e1, and that would be a battery on h4, which might cause black some concern. So it's a little bit of a liability here. b6 was played as though, well, maybe bishop b7 or bishop a6, and then maybe the queen moves and castle queenside. For the moment, this next move stops bishop a6, queen e2, and okay, and it might later go to f2 still if needed. Okay, so black now interestingly plays a reversing maneuver, knight b8, because actually he is really keen to get this bishop on the diagonal. It seems logical enough, because white hasn't got a light square bishop in any case. So it seems fair enough to do that. After rook fd1, bishop a6, gaining a tempo, but it's kicking the queen maybe to a useful square, this e1, hitting h4, which is black's kind of liability. So at the moment it looks as though it's safely supported, that h4 pawn. Knight d7, and now white plays actually b4, which not only deprives black of the use of the c5 square, but might also imply later a4 and b5, gaining a bit of space, and a pawn on b5 would be a nice hook to get a knight, one of these knights, to that juicy c6 square. Okay, but in this position, Yasser does a rerouting maneuver, knight f8, making use of that free g6 square, which would support h4. So again, a seemingly logical move, but now comes a4, and black's position is starting to look, you know, a little bit creaky if b5 and knight d4 are indeed, you know, a powerful combination to mark out that c6 square. The bishop actually doesn't want to be pushed back to b7, because imagine a blockade, it's going to be quite restricted behind its own pawn. Yasser actually plays bishop c4 here. Now knight cd4, and it looks as though white does have a very comfortable grip on the position. This is quite an annoying central knight hitting black in many places, but it seems, you know, it's black solid enough for the moment on f5 and e6, and white would seem as though he hasn't got any major strategic pawn breaks. You know, g3 is discouraged. You know, black would get, you know, pressure. So what is there to be concerned with as black here? Well, okay, Queen d7 is played, and now b5, highlighting c6, and the bishop, of course, not being on b7, can't do anything much about knight c6. And in fact, after knight g6, with this pawn protected, white does have the option to play knight c6, and he uses it. So it looks as though here, well, what is going on here? Is white really threatening, for example, to take and try and loosen h4? Maybe bishop f2 is then on the cards. But certainly castling queenside is now illegalized after knight c is stopping the king castling. But white would relish that anyway with a5 coming up. So the black king is safer perhaps just playing king f8 as played. But this bishop now has been kind of trapped in the opponent's territory here. And it's actually attacked now, prompting this next move. There's not too many options for that bishop. It doesn't really want to allow takes and that horrible d takes. That would be a very weak pawn. He plays bishop d3. But now we have a case, it seems. Well, it seems to be a case of creating exploitable weaknesses via access routes. This next move opens up lines. What does it actually open up? Potentially, by vacating c3, that diagonal might actually be useful. It's also undermining black's structure here, and it's making use tactically of a pin. You know, if black had taken, there's a pin that can be used. Knight takes c4 against the bishop. That knight might be very nice on c4 here. And that bishop would be very vulnerable on d3, with maybe knight b2 being threatened next. So in this position, black can hardly play d takes c4. He's already got a bit of a creaky position, because also if black is being forced to take here, then there's potential for liberating further this diagonal. So the access route seems, this diagonal seems already to be creaking for black suddenly in this position. This queen is not ideal. The rooks are not ideally connected here. They're not connected at the moment. White's rooks are connected, and this central rook and that knight, you know, white's pieces all look quite menacing all of a sudden here after c4. In fact, it could be argued black's position is in dire trouble here already. Let's just get the engine verdict of this position after c4. It seems as though it's not such a big deal technically from an engine point of view here. Rook g8, and white he's approaching a pawn advantage without actually being a pawn up, though, so that doesn't look too good, but it doesn't look absolutely, you know, a crushing advantage. It seems rook g8 trying to get some counterplay like that would be interesting. Okay. So in this position, maybe Yasser did make his position considerably worse. With this pawn having the potential to be liberated, it doesn't seem a good idea to put anything sensitive on this diagonal. Especially easy to say in retrospect after seeing the game score and the result of the game. King g7, okay, is potentially asking for trouble. There's already an access route being constructed, and it's like putting something of great importance on that access route. And this is what happens. White now takes on d5, and unless black wants this self pin with the bishop here, say queen takes d5, this looks like an incredibly dangerous self pin with knight b3, or, you know, maybe threatening knight c1. It's difficult for black to extricate himself from this kind of position. Nothing's immediately hanging. This knight's protecting e7, but actually there's an immediate threat also Oh, okay, knight c1. It just looks horrendous for that self pin. But here, e takes d5, and you see now knight b1, a sort of very, very dangerous attacking retreat move. Well, gaining a tempo, of course, it's hitting the bishop, but it is also implying that the queen could usefully use the c3 square, and of course that seems to be a very dangerous checking line if it wasn't for the pawn on e5 at the moment. The bishop goes to c4, and now the queen does go to c3, immediately threatening e6 check, which would win material. And here black looks to be in very, very big trouble, because also there's a very nasty threat of queen takes c4, just using that pin against the queen. That d5 pawn isn't really protecting the c4 bishop. So Yasser's position looks absolutely critical. Let's just get an engine evaluation here. Is it as bad as it looks? Yes, it's looking like a disaster if it's nearly +2. That's quite bad. This brief analysis, step 16. So let's just stop that. It does look like a terrible position. So I think he's already lost it here. The position's gone. He plays queen e6, which is subject to harassment, that queen. But it's not immediately attacked with, say, knight d4. Instead, Hikaru Nakamura plays knight d2. And now we see rook hc8. And although white seems to have the pleasant option of knight takes c4, here, what's happened with this last move, there's a sign of kind of weakness that the queen, actually, its reverse route has been blocked by its own rook. So maybe this wasn't a particularly good move to try and offer maximum resistance to play this move, rook hc8. Because now, actually, knight d4 as a forcing move is made use of, knowing that the queen cannot go back to c8, can only go, in fact, in this position, rather disastrously, to d7. And now, unfortunately, there's an absolutely crushing move, setting up one of the most powerful available tactics in the game of chess, a discovered check, and also a double check at the same time. I wonder if you can see the move which sets up this powerful tactical idea. If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay. e6. Unfortunately, it's a line clearance. It's setting up a double check and a discovered check. Okay, three tactical kind of themes in one move. Okay, now if takes, then it looks as though, well, there's also a double check on e6. So which one is more powerful, you might ask? Intuitively, I think knight takes f5 is very interesting, because it doesn't leave the knight imprint after, say, king f7. There would still be like queen g7, and then maybe queen takes g6. Let's engine check this. Actually, after e6, unfortunately, Yasser realized his position was hopeless, and he resigned here. Let's just check, just to make sure. So after it takes, I think knight takes f5 is much stronger than knight e6, as I assumed. So, okay, if king f7, you just play the check here, and then you win the knight, and it's all over, really. Okay. Now, if king f8, then I think it's much the same, actually. Check, and you're picking up the knight with check. So just a piece up, and it's all over. So, okay, it's all gone wrong here after e6. This is absolutely crushing. So it seems, if we look at an evaluation shift, it went from +2 to being plus about 6 there with rook hc8 on evaluation shift. But if we rewind earlier, black Had a difficult position here after knight d2, but you see it was kept below a 1 unit advantage technically, but the advantage seemed to increase after king g7. It's like putting sensitive goods on an access route. That king g7 increased white's advantage technically. Maybe okay, so c takes d5 is a very strong move. If queen takes d5, as mentioned, it's like going into a self-pin, but apparently even knight takes e7 might be very, very useful here before using the pin. And here actually there's a threat now of rook a3. So this is a nasty use of the pin. Very secure use of that pin. And I assume that's eventually like winning material. Or white can take the time to win material. Okay, so queen f2. If knight g5, there might be queen b4. So okay, white's still winning material here eventually. So before this, the evaluation, it was just drifting into a much worse position, from a very uncomfortable looking position from a human perspective here. So some key mistakes made things a lot easier for white after king g7. The king was actually an exploitable weakness, as it turned out, vividly exploited, and this rook hc8 really was the end of it, really. Let's look in overview and summary then. So it was a very novel second move against the French defence. So Nakamura has taken great risks in openings over the last few months, and they make for very entertaining and exciting games in new territory. He's been playing things like the Evans Gambit, the King's Gambit, all sorts of things. It's really, he's one of the most interesting super grandmasters in my opinion, and it's always a pleasure to look at his games. So he's made this system look like a very dangerous weapon. If black casually thinks they can secure a knight on f5, which is something I've emphasized myself in videos, it seems there's a very dark side to this, an antidote strategy, that white will simply take that knight at some point, and black has to be very careful. I think Yasser, after said e takes e5 would have been preferred, that he was kind of squeezed on both sides of the board in this game, as it turned out. So he has been squeezed on the queen's side here, evidently, and he's got a fixed weakness restrained on the king's side, that h4. So he has to be careful about his piece arrangements. This plan of getting the knight here seemed logical enough to support the h4 pawn, but you know, this other piece which ventured into the opponent's territory, we've got a piece on the pawn venturing into territory, but they seem just to be set up as tactical targets. And what was worse was this line opening, basically gaining access across this diagonal, with potentially the e-pawn dangerously being able to move forward now at just the right moment of maximum embarrassment for black, which came pretty soon, in fact, after this unfortunate rook hc8, where the queen now is pushed back to the unfortunate d7 square, just right for e6. So, okay, a neat game. It looks like a crushing win. It was one of Yasser's worst ever US championships, unfortunately. I hope he can bounce back and play really well next year. Okay, but congratulations to Nakamura, who actually clinched the US championship ahead of his nearest rival, Kamsky, who he managed to beat in a game we've also video annotated on this channel with the black pieces, and a very exciting Sicilian Najdorf game, which I recommend you check out. So, okay, congrats to Naka for being creative and exciting though. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.